For decades, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been one of the closest partnerships in the modern world. The two countries share the longest peaceful border on the planet, and every single day, billions of dollars worth of goods, services, and resources move back and forth across that border. From energy and automobiles to agriculture and technology, the economies of both nations are deeply intertwined. Because of this close connection, many people assume that serious economic conflict between the two countries is almost impossible, but history has shown that even the closest allies can clash when national interests collide. In recent years, discussions about trade tensions between the United States and Canada have resurfaced, especially around policies associated with Donald Trump and his approach to global trade. His administration emphasized the idea that the United States had been treated unfairly in many international trade agreements. That perspective reshaped how Washington approached economic partnerships, even with long-standing allies like Canada. While the two countries continued to cooperate in many areas, the tone of the relationship began to change, and disputes that once stayed mostly behind closed doors started appearing in public debates and headlines. Trade disagreements between the United States and Canada are not new. For decades, both countries have argued over industries such as lumber, dairy, steel, and automobiles. These disagreements typically arise when one country believes the other is protecting its own industries too aggressively. Canada, for example, maintains strict protections for its dairy sector through a system known as supply management. This system controls production levels and limits imports in order to protect Canadian farmers from international competition. American officials have repeatedly criticized this approach, arguing that it prevents U.S. dairy producers from accessing the Canadian market fairly. At the same time, Canada has often raised concerns about American tariffs and trade restrictions. One of the most famous examples involves softwood lumber. The United States has periodically imposed tariffs on Canadian lumber imports, claiming that Canadian producers receive unfair government subsidies. Canada, however, has consistently rejected these claims and argued that the tariffs are simply a way to protect American lumber companies from competition. These disputes have lasted for decades and have gone through multiple rounds of negotiations and legal challenges. During the presidency of Donald Trump, trade tensions took on a new level of intensity. Trump frequently argued that existing trade deals did not benefit the United States as much as they should. One of his major goals was to renegotiate trade agreements in order to secure what he described as better terms for American workers and businesses. This effort eventually led to the replacement of the long-standing North American Free Trade Agreement, commonly known as NAFTA. NAFTA had governed trade between the United States, Canada, and Mexico for more than 2 decades. It created one of the largest free trade zones in the world and dramatically increased economic integration across North America. However, critics argued that it also contributed to job losses in certain industries, particularly manufacturing. Trump made renegotiating NAFTA a key part of his political agenda, and after months of negotiations, the agreement was replaced by a new framework called the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, often referred to as USMCA. The USMCA introduced new rules for several industries, especially automobile manufacturing. It required a higher percentage of car parts to be produced in North America in order for vehicles to qualify for tariff-free trade. The agreement also included changes to labor standards and digital trade regulations. While leaders from all 3 countries ultimately supported the New Deal, the negotiations revealed just how complicated and sometimes fragile the economic relationship between the United States and Canada could be. Even after the new agreement was signed, disagreements did not disappear. In fact, several new disputes emerged almost immediately. Issues related to agriculture, energy exports, and industrial regulations continued to create friction between the two governments. In some cases, businesses on both sides of the border worried that political disagreements could disrupt supply chains that had been carefully built over decades. The automobile industry offers a good example of how interconnected the two economies have become. Many vehicles sold in North America are built using parts that cross the US-Canada border multiple times during production. An engine might be produced in the United States, assembled into a vehicle in Canada, and then sold back to American consumers. Because of this highly integrated system, even small trade barriers can create significant problems for manufacturers. Energy is another major factor in the relationship. Canada is one of the largest suppliers of oil and natural gas to the United States. Pipelines and energy infrastructure connect, the two countries in ways that are difficult to replace quickly. When political disagreements arise over energy projects or environmental regulations, the consequences can extend beyond politics and into the broader economy. Despite these tensions, it is important to remember that cooperation between the United States and Canada remains extremely strong. The two countries continue to collaborate on defense, environmental protection, border security, and technological development. Their economies are so closely connected that a full-scale trade war would likely harm both sides significantly. However, the possibility of economic conflict still worries analysts. In today's global economy, trade disputes can escalate quickly, especially when political pressure and domestic economic concerns are involved. Leaders in both countries often face demands from industries that want stronger protections from foreign competition. When those pressures grow, even long-standing partnerships can be tested. For Canada, maintaining stable access to the American market is crucial. A large portion of Canadian exports go to the United States, and many Canadian jobs depend on cross-border trade. Any serious disruption could have major economic consequences. At the same time, Canadian leaders also want to protect domestic industries and maintain policies they believe support local businesses and workers. From the American perspective, policymakers often argue that trade agreements must evolve to reflect changing economic realities. Advances in technology, shifts in global supply chains, and new geopolitical challenges have transformed international trade over the past several decades. As a result, some American officials believe that stronger enforcement of trade rules is necessary to protect domestic industries and ensure fair competition. The broader global context also plays an important role. As major economies around the world compete for influence, trade relationships are becoming increasingly strategic. Countries are paying closer attention to supply chains, resource security, and economic resilience. In this environment, even disputes between friendly nations can take on greater significance. If tensions between the United States and Canada were ever to escalate into a serious trade conflict, the consequences could extend far beyond North America. Global markets might react quickly, especially in industries such as energy, agriculture, and manufacturing. Companies that rely on cross-border supply chains could face uncertainty, and investors might become cautious about long-term projects in the region. At the same time, both countries have strong incentives to avoid such an outcome. The economic benefits of cooperation are enormous, and both governments understand the risks of disrupting one of the most integrated trade relationships in the world. This is why most disputes eventually lead to negotiations, legal arbitration, or compromise rather than permanent confrontation. In many ways, the story of US-Canada trade relations reflects a broader reality of international politics. Even the closest allies will occasionally disagree when economic interests clash. What matters most is how those disagreements are managed and whether both sides remain committed to finding solutions that protect long-term cooperation. Looking ahead, the future of this relationship will likely depend on how leaders balance domestic political pressures with the need for economic stability. Trade agreements will continue to evolve, industries will adapt to new technologies, and both countries will face new challenges in a rapidly changing global economy. For now, the partnership between the United States and Canada remains one of the most important economic relationships in the world. While tensions may occasionally rise and political debates may become heated, the deep connections between the two nations make cooperation not only beneficial but essential. And that is why any talk of a trade war between these two neighbors attracts so much attention. When the world's closest economic partners begin to argue, people everywhere start asking the same question. Could this relationship truly change, or will cooperation once again prove stronger than conflict?